Bellemans, and this is another video about, of course, Vietnam. The ones who seen the previous videos, they know that I was working on some books about the influence of the logographic writing on the Vietnamese language. And when I was doing so, I had to study, of course, about Vietnam. And there are a lot of books about the history of Vietnam. And I would love to advise one of them is this one, The Making of Vietnam, by Van Tran. And it's a really it's a small book, but it's very interesting because it has every time short stories, just a few pages, and then it goes to the next. So it's a very easy reading and it's very informative. So, and the history of Vietnam is really so interesting because Vietnam, the country Vietnam is in a social way, it has always been very, very modern, much more contemporary than many countries even today. So when the Han Chinese invaded Vietnam, they made their writing and the logographic writing mandatory, and well, that's about 2000 years ago. And in that time, Vietnam had already a very interesting society. And now I will, in this video, I will talk about the Hoan Kiem Lake, you know, with the famous Hanoi Hoan Kiem Lake with the famous story. I will come later to that. But first, the history of Vietnam is so incredibly interesting, and it teaches us so much. And the funny thing is, you see, I had not only to read and to learn about the history of Vietnam, I also had to read and to learn about the history of China, because they invaded Vietnam, and I had to know why made them their writing mandatory, and how was it about the writing, and how were the Chinese, the Han Chinese and the other, thinking about the Vietnamese. And it's so interesting, and there's a very funny well, it's not a small history, but a very interesting aspect of it is that in China, Confucius was very, very important, and in his view, you have the society, and then you have the government, and then you have the man and the son, and so on. Women there were not that important. Well, they were kind of important, but like a king, they had hundreds of them just to produce some new kings. In Vietnam, they considered women in a different way. They considered a woman just as human beings. And when the Chinese were invading Vietnam, you always had uprisings. And then what the Chinese did was they killed the men. And then they thought, well, when the men are dead, no more uprising. So the rest will be quiet. But that's not Vietnam. So in Vietnam, you had some women who were taking over the task of their killed husband. And women in war are quite famous. In France you had Jeanne d'Arc, she's very famous. In China you had Mulan in 400 and so on. In 300 something you had a 13-year-old girl who was become a war woman in China. But in Vietnam, in 240, you had already Lady Trieu. And in 40, you had already the Hai Ba Trung sisters. And that's special. They all Lady True, Hypertung, they all were riding on elephants. And when you look at this kind of elephant, this is a typical Vietnamese elephant. He has 8 legs and things like that. So the Vietnamese or the Chinese, they were very confused. And then there were big elephants and those small tiny girls who were very, very war women. And not only the Hypertung, but the whole army had many, many women from whom the husband was killed, and they became the generals and they became the war. So, because the Chinese did not understand the Vietnamese culture, the Trung sisters, they swept them away and they swept them back to China. Then, a few years later, a few 100,000 or just 100,000 big army came back and they defeat the Trung sisters because they didn't have that big army. So those things you learn when you learn about the Vietnamese history. It's really, there's so many interesting things during the years when I'm reading it and I think, wow, they did 600 years ago already what today is brought like some new ideas. They did that already in Vietnam 500-600 years ago. So there's room for a lot of videos about those things. But now I must focus on the Hanoi story about the returned sword. And it's a very nice story, everybody knows that. What I want to tell, to understand, we have to go back to the history. When I was studying why they started with the logographic writing to make it mandatory in Vietnam, it wasn't only in Vietnam, they also did it in the whole China, because there were certain reasons for it. So I had to read a lot. And then one of the first things we saw is you had about 3,000 years ago, the Zhou dynasty. And then you see, it only has this part. They were the Chinese, and they saw themselves as very cultivated. And in the north, everywhere, they had barbarians. They were not interested in barbarians because they were not cultivated. 500 years later, that was 3,000 years ago, 500 years later, the Zhou was gone, and you had already the king, and then you saw suddenly several of those parts that later became the three kingdoms and things like that. And you see the Chu here, and the Wu, and the Yue. And this makes it interesting, because those were all so-called barbarian. But the Yue, they were very, very good. And even the Chinese, they said, the Yue people, they're barbarians, but the metallurgic knowledge is incredibly good. And when we see a little bit later, when in the time when the Vietnamese invaded the Han invaded in Vietnam, then we saw that they took already over here, and here you can see the Minh Yue, and it's also called Minh Viet, because Yue and Viet, it is the same. And Yue, it means an ethnic group. And this ratio, it was called the Bayue, and that means the 100 ethnic groups. And now the people who know something about Vietnam, they start to think, wait a moment, the 100 ethnic groups, 100, that's something in the history of Vietnam. Because the history of Vietnam starts with the Hung Vuong kings. And you have the first one, and he has a son, Lac Long Quang, and he married Ao Co. And Ao Co, she got 100 children. And when they divorced, those 100 children became the 100 ethnic groups of the Viet. It's, for me, a little bit too much coincidence with the Bayou and the 100 children of Ao Co. So, Ao Co, it was a Hong Bang dynasty in the Vang Lang, but in the Chinese history they're talking about Yue. And they were very good in metallurgics. So, they are still, this is a picture we made in a contemporary bronze foundry near Da Nang. They were very, very traditional. They make those beautiful gongs for the ethnic groups. And interesting was that the Chinese, the Han Chinese and the King Chinese, all those, they were very fond of the bronze articles, objects they made in Yue, Vietnam. And when you, they also had a king, the Yue, who was fighting against the Wu and the Yu and the Lu, and he won. So his people wants to give him a very, very beautiful artifact, a very beautiful sword, a very beautiful sword, bronze sword. So when you want to give your king something very beautiful, then you do not go to the next shop to buy and say, you got something here, or no, you go to the most famous place where they make the most beautiful bronze. And that was in Đông Sơn. And that village is famous for those beautiful drums, Đông Sơn drums. I was lucky to visit in Ho Chi Minh a collector who had several of them in his private, very beautiful drums. So I'm quite sure they went there and they bought the beautiful sword. They said it must be incredibly beautiful and very good. And I forgot to tell that Lac Long Quan, he was the son of the Dragon King. And of course he was a fairy, but that's in general no. So when they bought those beautiful sword, I think the Dragon King, he bred on it and make it very, very, very special. And then they gave it to King Duong. Well, it's Chinese, so my Chinese is even worse than my Vietnamese. And that was in 2,500 years ago, and exact the same period that the bronze Đông Sơn drums were on his, they were so famous, people came from everywhere to buy those drums. So, and then that sword disappeared somehow. And the history went further. So at that time, when they were given the sword, Yue, they were still occupying southeast China, South Central China and Vietnam. But then, 200-300 years later, the Han invaded in Vietnam. And then we had in 40 the uprising by the Trung sisters and 82. In 900, something like that, then there was another war because the Vietnamese were always fighting against the occupation Lord No Nguyen, and he did a very, very nice trick at the Bang Dang River. You have to see that, you can see that in any water puppet theater, it's very, very famous. But in 1400, around that time, in 900 they were gone, and then only the Mongols, they came back. They tried the invincible army of the Mongols. They came and they also discovered the story of the Bac Dang River, and they also were defeated by the Vietnamese. But then there was a Minh King, the guy with all the big army, marine and all those boats, 600 boats or something like that, and he wanted to take back Vietnam. And at that time, I think the Dragon Lord gets so tired of it that he took back the sword and he gave it to Lê Lợi. And he said, you can use this sword, this is so incredibly good. And Lê Lợi did that, and he defeated the Ming army, and then later he had to give back the sword. There are many books about and stories just like this is a book for children and for people who like to study Vietnamese, so they can read English and Vietnamese. It's not always matching each other, but the idea is good. So that's the story of the sword, I think, because in the sword story they do not tell where the sword comes from, and I think it is, or it should be, the sword that was made in Đông Sơn, given to the King Nguyen, and it came back to Vietnam to teach the Chinese a lesson, and again. So after that it went in the golden turtle, took it back in the lake, and then it disappeared. Until 1965, then it suddenly came back in Hubei, in China. And we just have to think, what happens in 1965 in Vietnam? Well, but that's for somebody else to find out. So I thank you. There are many stories about Vietnam, and it's so interesting. Thank you.